Hi, my name is Mick Napier and I'm speaking to you on behalf of Stop the JNF UK. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first of half a dozen monthly webinars from Stop the JNF UK, where we will aim to explain the nature of that racist organisation, its position inside the State of Israel and around the world, and we'll also make suggestions and share best practice with what a lot of people around the world have been doing to challenge the Jewish National Fund. First slide. So the series of webinars will aim to explain the JNF. It presents a rosy picture of itself, but the reality is is very sinister indeed. Next slide, please. So this is who we are at the moment. I stress that we are a work in progress. We are a coalition. I'm one of the representatives from the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We also have representatives from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign in the UK, and IJAN, the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network. Today, I'll be drawing on testimony, expert evidence from three speakers. Ghada Karmi, a prolific and quality writer and author who has written extensively over the last decades on issues related to Palestine, Zionism and Israel. Second individual who'll be speaking is Omar Barghouti, the founder, one of the co-founders of the International BDS campaign, a representative of the Boycott National Committee in Palestine. And the third expert who'll be speaking to you is Joseph Sheckler. And Joseph is a representative of, bear with me a second. I know Joseph very well, but I want to get this right. He's a representative of Habitat International Coalition, for whom he is the coordinator with the Housing and Land Rights Network. And they support people fighting for land rights and housing rights in many, many parts of the world. In fact, the coalition operates in 100 countries and has 450 affiliates. Joseph is an expert in the JNF in relation to international human rights law, and his testimony, along with the two others, will be extremely valuable. Can I just say before we move on, we want to relate what we have to say to action, what actions that people have already taken, are taking, and that others in some of the jurisdictions of the JNF around the world will be able to take. And this will be in the spirit of the BDS movement, as Omar will explain. The BDS campaign comes into existence because of a failure over many, many decades of lobbying to persuade our rulers and our politicians and the great and the good to take a stand on the issue of human rights for all, and that includes Palestinians. We are minded that that's the case, that the BDS movement is necessary because of the failure or because of the active complicity of our rulers, our elites in the crimes of the State of Israel. And perhaps just here to remind people, if they don't already know, as far back as 2003, the EU conducted an opinion poll. Every member state, which came to the interesting conclusion that citizens were extremely hostile to what the State of Israel was doing. In fact, majorities in every country decided that Israel was the major threat to world peace. But Israel could rest assured even after that, because the EU Foreign Affairs spokesman, Franco Frattini, promised Israel that the opinions of EU citizens would not influence EU foreign policy. I think a stark underlining of why we need the BDS campaign, and within that, the Stop the JNF campaign. Next slide, please. Yes, Stop the JNF International has also been active since 2010. I remember we had a preliminary conversation with the groups that got together to call for the founding of Stop the JNF on the fringes of an anti-racism conference in Geneva. The founding groups were Habitat International, Boycott National Committee, IJAN, and Scottish PSC. That led to a conference a year later, 12 months later, in Edinburgh, where representation there was representation from Europe, France, Germany, from North America, from Israel, and from Palestine, committed to the goal of challenging the Jewish National Fund in Israel, in Palestine, and internationally. Next slide, please. So we'll be talking about the nature of the JNF and why we fight against it. It's worthwhile pointing out here because we're in a period now of kind of madness around the world, where anyone who stands up for the interests of the Palestinian people and has a worked out critique of the actions of the State of Israel is deemed to be an anti-Semite. Like, a simple lesson: Tony Blair is a Zionist. Anyone who supports the program of a Jewish state in Palestine, and increasingly a state that dominates and denies the rights of Palestinians, qualifies for the label of Zionist. To oppose that is to oppose a political program. It does not involve in any way hostility to a group of people, to Jews as a people. I was old enough to be involved in a campaign against apartheid in South Africa. We were not remotely, and nobody ever dreamt of calling us hostile to white people. I know it's worth pointing out that you can oppose the mafia without being anti-Italian, and it's worthwhile remembering that a New York mobster, I think his name was Colombo, set up the American-Italian civil rights campaign in order to provide a mask for the activities of his particular mafia family. But against a system of sectarian or ethnic domination, but not against any population. Ronnie Kasrils, I remember talking about how he, actually a Jewish white guy from South Africa, was a militant and an activist in the African National Congress. And he described how once at a military training school, actually in Zambia, where he was playing an instructor's role, some new black kids came from South Africa, and when they saw Ronnie Kasril, they were taken aback to see this white guy at the ANC training place. And Ronnie said, we had to point out, it's not the pigment, it's the system. We're not against white people, we're against a system of white supremacy. And it's exactly the same with Stop the JNF. We're against a system of privilege and violation of Palestinian rights, not a population. Next slide, please. Sorry, can you go back? That's I do apologise. So this is the series of 6 webinars. The one here is to frame, provide an introduction, which will be taken up, and issues will be developed in depth in the succeeding 5. So, but the key point is the JNF is a pillar of Israeli apartheid. It's a non-state institution to which residential zoning apartheid is subcontracted by the Israeli state. We'll look in depth at that before and after 1967. Then we'll look at the nexus of forces that are allied with the JNF inside the Israeli state, how the JNF divides the labor with the Jewish Agency, the Histadrut, the World Zionist Organization, and so on. And then in September and October, September we'll look at the JNF's plans for the future, which are truly sinister, involving an intensification of ethnic cleansing and the replacement of native Palestinians, Bedouin and others, with Jews. The last one that's programmed for October will take a look at the JNF's baseless claims to be an organization committed to environmental justice. The so-called greenwashing of the JNF, and people who are very actively involved in climate justice campaigning and actively involved in the struggle for Palestinian freedom will explain precisely why the JNF deserves no toleration whatsoever among those very large groups of individuals and institutions campaigning campaigning against violations of the environment and the degradation of the environment. Next slide, please. Okay, before we look at the reality, let's look at the claims of the JNF, a sugary saccharin 2.5 minute production by the JNF UK, and then we'll take a look at the reality with our expert witnesses. Video, please. Please. Well, really, every word in that was a lie and extremely misleading and dishonest. The JNF is security, but of course it works with its tractors and bulldozers to maximize insecurity for Palestinians whose land it wishes to expropriate. It talks about building Israel, but the real effort is to bury Palestine, quite literally sometimes under forests which they plant on the ruins of Palestinian ethnically cleansed communities. They talk about planting trees, but you know, Israel has destroyed 1 million olive trees since 1967, burning, uprooting, demolishing. It's an absolute horror story of Palestinian farmers and landowners, communities having these trees destroyed. 1 million in you know, since 1967, and the process is ongoing. So that's the claim. Those are the saccharin claims of the JNF. These are the claims that they use to try to get Jews and others around the world to support them by donating money to their efforts. Let's look at the reality. Next slide, please. This is a quote from a JNF pamphlet published by the JNF UK from their London office in 1967. I mean, the language is bizarre, of course. but it's absolutely true what they said. Today, the JNF tractor follows in the wake of the army tank. Areas that they said have been restored to Israel, as in conquered in 1967, in addition to those conquered in 48, are being put under the plough. The preparation of this land is the primary task of the JNF. And that's the reality. The tanks do their grisly work, the soldiers do their work, and the JNF tractors come along behind and develop the dispossession, carry on the dispossession of Palestinian communities, and work to make sure that those refugees who have been driven out may never return, that the crimes are covered over by the planting of the JNF organising tree planting over villages which have been obliterated and the inhabitants violently dispersed into refugee camps. And it's ongoing. Al-Araqib, I can't remember, and I'm embarrassed about this, but I remember when Al-Araqib, a Bedouin village in the Negev, had been demolished 100 times. JNF tractors flying JNF flags and bulldozers were involved in the attempts to crush the lives, the social existence of these people, and that process is ongoing. So Zakharin claims about the benevolent work, the big work of the JNF, but the reality on the ground is ethnic cleansing, accompanied by state violence whenever necessary. And Al-Araqib is one example in the Negev, but one could provide other current examples right across the entire area of Palestine under the control of the Israeli military. Next slide, please. These are the countries in which the JNF has offices, where they operate. Well, generally speaking, they function as a charity. That is, they enjoy subsidies from taxpayers who may absolutely bitterly oppose what the JNF does, but their governments force taxpayers to provide an involuntary subsidy to their activities. I don't really know the detail of how the JNF operates in many of these jurisdictions. I know that they're challenged in many of them, and there's fantastic work going on. But perhaps the nature of the JNF can be gleaned by the fact that this creature in the bottom right is an honorary patron of the JNF UK, together with his partner in crime, Gordon Brown, another ex-British Prime Minister, a British ex-Prime Minister. And it's interesting that an honorary patron for the JNF in Britain, enjoying taxpayer subsidies, this man is unable to appear in public anywhere in Britain. He probably wins. He probably wins the crowded. He's probably in front in the crowded field to be the most loathed and despised individual in Britain, held in utter contempt by many, many millions of people, many of them actively holding him in contempt, such that if he were to appear with any notice in a public place, he'd be massively challenged by the population. He's a patron of the JNF. That's the caliber of the allies that they have, and they do have elite influence. But I stress that that's not secure, because in the UK, it used to be simply a rule that as soon as you became one of the leaders of the three major political parties, you would then become a patron of the JNF. It was part of the ladder of ambition for one's career. So they had 3 out of 3 of the Labour, Lib Dem, Tory parties. Now they have none. Even David Cameron, an ardent Zionist, backed away from the JNF after a motion to the Parliament gathered scores and scores of support condemning the racist policies of the JNF UK. Cameron backed off, and the other 2 leaders, who were they again? Ed Miliband for the Labour and whoever it was for the Lib Dems, declined the usual ceremony of becoming an honorary patron for the JNF. They must have thought, they didn't tell us honestly, that the JNF was too toxic for them to continue with open patronage. So they organize in 40 different, more than 40, 44, 45, I think, legal jurisdictions, and they are susceptible to challenge in every one of them. Next slide, please. Okay. Israel's, as Omar Barghouti will point out in his contribution, the BNC, the Boycott, Divestment and Sanction Campaign, is based on the recognition of Israel as a settler colonial state. This is a reality which they are greatly at pains to cover up now. But there was a time when the Zionist movement, prior to the founding of the State of Israel, was open about its colonial nature. One could subscribe to the Jewish Colonial Trust, to various other colonial entities, in order to help to build the Zionist presence in Palestine, to dispossess the natives there. And it's worth remembering that this is a response, it's a perverse response, it's an unhealthy response to massive European anti-Semitism. But whereas the great majority of Jews in Europe, secular and religious, saw their future in Europe where they would join with others to fight anti-Semitism, the Zionist movement really saw that the only way that Jews could be acceptable to European elites was to emulate them, was to join in a colonizing venture outside Europe. Look at us, we're just the same as the Belgians in the Congo, the British in Australia, the Spaniards in South America. We're violent, we're potentially genocidal, but look, this is a colonial project, and look how European we are by emulating the Europeans, who, by the way, don't want us in Europe, the European elites. They much prefer us to colonize and violate some other part of the world on their behalf. So yeah, Israel is a settler colonial project, always has been. It used to be open about it. There's a massive amount of work in the academic sphere about settler colonial studies and how Israel fits the paradigm. Every example of settler colonial projects has some unique characteristics, but Israel has vastly more in common with America in the 18th, 19th centuries, Europe and Australia and South America than its unique characteristics. Israel, a settler colonial project, that's how we understand the role of the JNF within that project. Next slide, please. So Ronald Storrs was the first Governor-General, British Governor-General following the conquest of Palestine, Governor-General of Jerusalem, in which role he welcomed and he had nothing but contempt for the Aborigines, as he called them, in Palestine. But he welcomed he understood, not just welcomed, he understood the Balfour Declaration, and he said famously or infamously, by supporting the Balfour Declaration, by supporting Zionism, Britain gets, quote, a loyal little Jewish Ulster in a sea of hostile Arabism. The model was Ulster, the model was Ireland. What Britain and the Scots actually had been doing for quite a long time, settling immigrant families in somebody else's land, violating their rights, killing large numbers of them, stealing the best land, and being protected by the colonial power in the act of doing so. So that the link, the nexus, the bond between the loyalist population and the colonial superpower, Britain in the case of Ireland and Palestine until the Second World War, was unshakable, because the settlers could not possibly violate the natives without the military and other backup of the colonial power. And Britain, of course, secured a loyal little Jewish Ulster, or a loyal real Ulster in Ireland, which served their interests very well against the native people. And, it's no accident that Ian Paisley was one of the founders of Northern Ireland Friends of Israel. He recognized a kindred spirit. Several Israelis, including Ehud Barak, have referred to Israel as a villa in the middle of the jungle. This racist language that, and Herzl started it, that Zionist state, the Jewish state, would be an extension of European civilization into the colonial world, would act on behalf of Europe against the native people there, controlling resources, building alliances with superpowers. But Israel was never, the Zionists were never for sale; they were always for hire, and they attached themselves to the dominant power in the region, Britain, until 1945. Britain was greatly weakened. America's star rose across the region, and the Zionists detached themselves from Britain and attached themselves to the rising power of the USA. Israel's a settler colonial project, and the JNF has to be seen in connection with that. Next slide, please. So as well as denying that the Zionist project is a colonial project, which used to be widely accepted by all concerned, Israel also objects to the designation and really fights fiercely against the designation of the state as an apartheid state. Omar and others will deal with this. All three of our experts today will deal with that. But it's worth pointing out that when you have Jewish-only roads, which I have been on, you're a quantum leap above even the apartheid system that obtained in South Africa for so long. When you have two separate legal systems, one for Jews and one for Palestinians, and they're very different, one's much harsher than the other, then you have an apartheid system. When the economy massively privileges groups, privileges Jews over non-Jews, when the investment in schools is a multiple for Jewish schools of that for Palestinian schools, then it's a full-fledged apartheid system. When a very rare situation where Jewish terrorists were arrested by the authorities there after murdering some Palestinians in a particularly brutal way, they objected very strongly to their members being tortured, saying, "Look, this is for Palestinians. You shouldn't be torturing Jewish terrorists." So all the way down the line, you see a fantastically different treatment for Palestinians from the treatment accorded to Jews by the apartheid system. It's an apartheid system. Now, people can deny that, but they can also claim that the sun rises in the west and sets in the east if they want. Next slide, please. Let's proceed to our next speaker. But before we do, this is Rada Karmi on the left, an iconic picture, one of the most brilliant concise visual statements of our position that one could ask for. Palestinian Rada Karmi is a Palestinian Arab, born in Jerusalem. Palestine is her home, but she cannot return. Elaine Siegel, one of her comrades, is an American Jew, born in the USA. As far as I know, never been to Israel, but certainly Israel's not her homeland. But according to Zionist discourse, she can return there. In the same way that I can return to Afghanistan. I've never been there, by the way. So Rada will now speak for about, I spoke to her on a reasonable line a couple of days ago. Rada Karmi is the author of a voluminous amount of works, but the two that I would recommend in connection with this is her memoir, In Search of Fatima, of the expulsion of her family among other Palestinians in '48, and a later work, Married to Another Man, which looks at the Zionist claims to Israel and Palestine, finds them wanting, and puts forward the case for Palestinian freedom and why everyone should support it. So here's a short video by Rada. I think it's 5 minutes and 57 seconds, if my memory serves me right. Can we play the video, please?
The Jewish National Fund is really at the heart of the Zionist project to take over Palestine. Its role cannot be overemphasized because although in many countries, including Britain, it projects a slightly benign image that it's a charity, that it promotes education, that it promotes communities. Of course, nothing could be further from the truth. The Jewish National Fund was established in 1901 with the precise aim to colonize Palestine, a country which at the time had a majority of Arab inhabitants, some of whom are my ancestors, and there was no possibility of fitting a new community together with the people who already lived in Palestine. But of course, undeterred, the Zionist project aimed from the beginning to take over the land and get rid of the people. But the way they did that was through this colonizing project, and this colonizing organization, the Jewish National Fund. And from that moment on, in a way, you know, one could say the Palestinians never stood a chance, because when the fund started, the JNF started to buy up land, it was incredibly unsuccessful in that, because it only managed to buy about 4 to 6% of the land of Palestine. It needed a helping hand, and the helping hand came in the shape of the British mandate over Palestine and the British determination to help the Zionists establish themselves in Palestine. Now, as I said previously, the Zionist project in its essence is, or was, to take over the land, but without the people. That was essential. Both of those aspects, you couldn't have one without the other. And the Jewish National Fund was busily taking over the land, and the militias, which was later to become the Zionist army and later the Israeli army, before 1948, were beginning and in fact, enforcing a strategy, a pernicious strategy of emptying the land of Palestine of its inhabitants. This was no haphazard thing. This was something completely worked out. There's a plan. There was a plan to it, sometimes called Plan Dalet, which was a master plan for emptying the villages and the towns of Palestine using a variety of violent means. One must be very clear about that. There was no question of persuasion or bribery. It had to be violence. That's the only way they could get the people to abandon their land. Now, I know about this firsthand, if you like, because my family was living in Jerusalem, in the western half of Jerusalem, and they became victim to the same strategy of emptying the western half of Jerusalem as it happened then. And we were among those people who fled in fear of our lives, and the rest, you know, people know in the creation of a diaspora of Palestinians, on the creation of refugee camps, people who had lived in that land and became stateless and homeless entirely because of the Jewish National Fund and the Zionist. But of course, what it led to was not only the expulsion of the indigenous people like myself, my family, but to the determination never to let them return. Now, that was also an essential aspect of the Jewish National Fund policy, of the Zionist project, of course, because if you went to the trouble of emptying the territory of its rightful inhabitants, well, your project wasn't going to be successful, was it, if they all came back, which is what they had the right to do, which is what they wanted to do. They were forbidden from returning by force. And in the end, the United Nations stepped in and passed a very important resolution, Resolution 194, in December 1948, which called on the new state of Israel to repatriate the Palestinian people who had been expelled. So we are at a point today where the project in its entirety, the basic fundamental Zionist project, working through such agencies as the Jewish National Fund, succeeded in emptying a country of its indigenous people, and furthermore, and this bit people tend to forget, succeeded in making sure they never return. You know, over time, and with the success of a project like this, the Zionists, today, of course, Israelis, went on. They were emboldened. They were encouraged to enact laws, to regard Palestinians as lesser human beings. The tragedy of Gaza today is testament to this attitude. But what it stems from is a racist attitude on the part of Zionists, which says there are individuals, human beings, who are of lesser value, of lesser worth, by virtue of being from a different ethnicity or from a different race. Now that is racism.
Okay, friends. Thank you. That was rather under lockdown, like my other guests speaking from London a few days ago. She did allude to the extreme violence that the JNF was involved in, but perhaps it's worthwhile just noting here that the JNF carried out meticulous research before 1948 on land ownership, social situation in Palestinian villages, and they identified those people who were most likely to resist and were actually resisting their dispossession. The so-called village files, which the JNF compiled, were then used subsequently to kill and to drive out particular individuals who might have formed nuclei of resistance. So the JNF is involved in ethnic cleansing in all its darkness, but also in the assassination squads, death squads, you'd have to say, which were part of that process. That was Ghada Karmi. Delighted that she was able to contribute as an academic and also as somebody whose family suffered in the Palestinian Nakba. My next guest spoke to us from Palestine, Omar Barghouti. He probably needs very little introduction to most of you. He's one of the co-founders of the Boycott National Committee, which groups together virtually every molecule of Palestinian civil society in support of the demands of the BDS campaign. Omar will speak for about 12 minutes and then we can move on after that. So here's Omar Barghouti speaking from Palestine. Nope, that's Joseph back. Oh, do we not have Omar? Is it possible to bring in Omar by another route? We have the video here. Okay, we got a small glitch there. While our technical support finds the video by Omar Barghouti, which we should have ready to play, let me move on to our third guest then, who's extremely valuable expert witness, and that's Joseph Shekler. I spoke to him on a very poor line. I spoke to him and we interacted on a very poor line from Cairo. We had tried once before and failed, but this was the best that we could do. But Omar's well worth listening to. He is a field officer, coordinator for the land rights campaign I alluded to earlier, Habitat International Coalition and the Housing and Land Rights Network. They organize across huge swathes of the world, and they take seriously land rights and the violation of those land and housing rights by powerful elites everywhere, not least Palestine. So if we could have the conversation with Joseph, listen carefully, because he talks about, he's a real expert in his field. He talks about 13 areas of violations of international law, which states are prohibited from carrying out. And he identifies 9 of them, really important, which Israel is not just guilty of carrying out, but is based upon. And that includes, obviously, ethnic cleansing, but it also includes, and this is interesting, any state is forbidden from forcing or insisting on nationality for a group of citizens of another country, as in British citizens who are Jewish. The JNF and the Israeli state goes out of their way to say that their natural home is in Israel. This, as Joseph points out in passing, is just one of the many ways in which Israel is based upon the violation of international law. But here's Joseph. Joseph Sheckler from Cairo.
States have only obligations domestically. They don't have rights vis-a-vis peoples. They have obligations vis-a-vis the population or the peoples within them. But in the external world and in the internal world of the state, there are certain activities that are prohibited. For example, the practices of torture, apartheid, forced evictions, cross-border harm, which is affecting other states, nuclear proliferation, population transfer, the serious crime of population transfer, prosecuted at Nuremberg in Tokyo, as you probably realize, racial discrimination, demographic manipulation, denial of self-determination, wanton destruction of property under humanitarian law, diversion of funds for colonization, slavery and slavery-like practices, and under general principles of international law and the law of nations, prohibited is also demanding allegiance from or imposing nationality obligations on citizens of other states. Now, among these 13 well-recognized prohibitions under public international law, whether they're peremptory norms or treaty obligations or general principles of international law, ergo omnes, 9 of these 13 are actually practiced as a matter of essential policy and program by the JNF and the other parastatal institutions.
So we're not just dealing with occasional breaches of law. We're not just dealing with mistakes. It's part of the core identity of the JNF that it be in conflict with these prescriptions of international law. Have I got that right?
Absolutely. Well, it's important also to understand, and maybe we can discuss this more at the end, how these institutions are actually trying to play the law on both sides. That is, carrying out the functions of a state throughout their history and being recognized under public international law as such, but at the same time, they're operating outside of government and on behalf of the state, carrying out these 9 categories of prohibited actions, but claiming to be private institutions. It's also important to note that this dual sort of schizophrenic character of the parastatal institutions emerges from time to time. For example, it was back in 2007-8, the JNF applied for consultative status as an NGO before ECOSOC in the UN. But of course, they lost that argument because, in fact, they aren't an NGO, but they claim to be. And before treaty bodies, the State of Israel has claimed that these parastatal institutions are registered under private law as private non-governmental organizations, but they're carrying out the functions of a state. So they have this dual character. It's a schizophrenia that imbues these institutions from the beginning. And these are all, these are characteristics shared by all of them, in fact. And a great area where the government of Israel, operating as the state of Israel, is prevented from carrying out some of these prohibited acts: racial discrimination, apartheid, diversion of funds for colonization, population transfer, etc. But those parastatal institutions operate nominally outside the government of Israel, but at the same time as agents of the state of Israel. It also means that these parastatal institutions do not fall directly under the purview or the oversight of the government of Israel. They are actually in some ways operating outside the government of Israel, within the state of Israel, and getting away with these prohibited acts in this ambiguous character as being sort of non-governmental, but at the same time agents of the state, with the colonization program, the forced displacement program, the implantation of settler program, the acquisition of all immovable properties possible. So when these organizations operate outside of the state of Israel, they claim to be non-governmental, which in some ways is true, but they're still agents of the state. It's a unique situation in the world, and because of this, it leads to a lot of confusion and a lot of sort of shell game action on the part of Israel and its supporters that don't want us to understand this intricacy, that the extraterritorial activities that are legally prohibited for any state and its government are being carried out in our own jurisdictions. That the articles of incorporation of these institutions, as you have noticed, identify Jews as belonging to a particular race or descendancy. And in the establishment of these institutions, a new concept was devised, that is Jewish nationality. And this has been shown to be the sort of the linchpin of the apartheid system that has operated in Palestine. Whereas, of course, one of our important mentors, in South Africa, who has given us the anatomy of apartheid in that country, has identified the Population Registry Act as the linchpin of that system, identifying different classifications of citizens or residents. In the case of Israel, it's Jewish nationality that is that linchpin. And that Jewish nationality is found in the founding documents of the JNF, the WZO, the Jewish Agency, and that is actually the principle that has been reaffirmed by the High Court of Israel on two very important occasions. We could go into the details of that for those who want to go deeper into the subject, but this has been the construct that has erected the regime of apartheid and the criteria for who benefits from the properties, the natural resources, water, land, immovable property, services, economic, social, and cultural rights, including of those non-Jewish citizens who are inside the state of Israel. So it's these parastatal institutions that really provide us the recipe, the formula upon which the whole system has been built.
Thank you, Joseph. Okay, can we move on? So Joseph made the point there that it's the idea of Jewish nationality is fundamental to the implementation of apartheid, to discrimination against Palestinians, that every Palestinians can access Israeli citizenship, but when it's nationality which is the determining factor in the allocation of resources and access to power. Those points made by Joseph and those points made by Ada will be developed much further in the webinars to come over the next 5 months. But I'm happy now to introduce my final guest, Omar Barghouti. We did find the video, sorry, it was under a slip of paper. And Omar starts off by framing the BNC call, the BDS call, for boycott against the Israeli settler colonial project, and he situates the JNF within that and opposition to the JNF. Here's Omar Barghouti speaking from Palestine a few days ago. Hi, Omar. The Hi. BNC has crafted the international boycott movement to target the Israeli state and institutions connected to that state rather than individuals. Why do you think the JNF internationally is a suitable target for boycott and divestment campaigns?
Hi. Yes, the Palestinian-led global boycott, divestment, and sanctions or BDS movement has from the beginning called for a boycott of not just the State of Israel as a regime of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid, but also of corporations and institutions that enable this regime to continue denying Palestinians our basic rights under international law. The JNF certainly qualifies as one of the most pernicious organizations involved from the very beginning of the settler colonization of Palestine in the expulsion of Palestinians, expropriation of Palestinian lands, support for Zionist militias' schemes to ethnically cleanse Palestinians, and later, after the State of Israel was established, in colonizing Palestinian land with Jewish-only settlers. The Jewish National Fund, so-called Jewish National Fund, there's nothing Jewish about it except the name, in the sense that there's nothing Jewish about settler colonialism and apartheid. There's nothing Jewish about ethnic cleansing. So by claiming Jewishness, JNF is covering up its very colonial system, its very colonial role in Israel's establishment and the expulsion of the Palestinian people.
The JNF presents itself as a benign organization. You as a Palestinian can see it very differently. Is the ethnic cleansing taking place across the entire area controlled by the Israeli state, inside and outside the Green Line, etc.?
Yes, the JNF currently owns about 13% of the Israel lands. 80% is owned by the State of Israel, the government itself. And the JNF has a controlling, or very close to a controlling role in the running of the Israeli Land Association, which controls the 93%, total 80 and 13%. Thus, 93% of the land controlled directly by the State of Israel is off limits to the indigenous Palestinians. The fact that they're not Jewish makes them ineligible to live, buy, lease, rent anywhere on this 93% because of the JNF's charter, which is very racist in nature. It says that it will control land in Palestine, in the State of Israel, the entire land, historic Palestine, for the benefit of Jews and only Jews, for the Jewish nation, not for the indigenous Palestinians, and certainly not for all citizens of Israel. So the JNF has always played a role in the colonization of both sides of the Green Line. Currently, it's still involved in Israeli plans to settle the Palestinian property owned by Bedouin Palestinians, indigenous Bedouins, in the Negev Desert, the Naqab, as well as in the West Bank. Through other organizations affiliated with the JNF, it is expropriating Palestinian land to enable Israel to grow its settlements, its illegal settlements, which are considered under international law a war crime. In fact, most of the 13% of the land of Israel that the JNF owns about 70% of it came into JNF's property after 1948, after the creation of the State of Israel, through the expropriation of Palestinian refugees' land that was pillaged by the State of Israel and by the Israeli army.
So the line, Omar, that is spun, you know how many things the Israeli state denies and its defenders deny, but the line that's spun that this land was acquired through market forces and by purchase from willing Palestinians, you would challenge that, yeah?
It doesn't matter what Israel says or what the JNF says. What matters is what international law says. International law says you cannot pillage, you cannot steal land that were vacated by refugees who were expelled or had to leave under conditions of conflict. So regardless what the causes of conflict were, the fact that Palestinian refugees left this land or were expelled, ethnically cleansed from this land, does not give anyone, certainly not the State of Israel or the JNF, any right under international law to own, expropriate this land, or to do with it what it pleases. This is expropriated refugees' lands. According to international law, it should return to every single refugee. And this is an individual as well as a collective right. So it cannot be given away by any political leadership. No matter how Israel tries to spin this, no matter how the JNF tries to spin this, they control pillaged Palestinian refugees' land, and this does not belong to them according to international law.
I believe the naked racism of the JNF even proved a little bit embarrassing for an Israeli Supreme Court on one occasion. And was there not some fancy footwork where they tried to mask this afresh? Can you on that, Omar?
Which particular Supreme Court decision? Because there were several cases against the JNF where the JNF had to defend itself. So which one are you referring to so that I can comment on it?
Well, you've got me there. I can't remember the exact detail.
Okay.
I simply remember that I can edit that last little bit out quite easily. But I simply remember that the naked racism of the JNF led to Supreme Court cases, and some of the learned judges felt that they had to make some amendments to landholding in Palestine to kind of recover that up, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
I think it will all go back to the charter of the JNF, which rejects equality as a matter of principle. It doesn't hide its face. It says this is only for the Jewish people across the world, the Jewish nation across the world, and it's not for the citizens of Israel who are not Jewish. So this naked racism, as you put it, is very much in the charter of the JNF. Now, the fact that the JNF has enormous influence in Israeli land administration and therefore controls the decision-making largely. And since the JNF's own charter is so racist, Israel basically could not get away with outsourcing its apartheid system to the JNF while claiming that it still believes in equality. Equality does not exist in Israel's basic laws. In the Israeli legal system, equality is not a principle. So the JNF got away with making its racist laws apply to the entire 93% that the Israeli land administration controls. So there were several legal challenges to this issue that Israel is claiming not to legalize inequality, but indeed it is doing that indirectly through outsourcing to the JNF. But of course, the Israeli so-called justice system is anything but a just system. It's very much a rubber stamp when it comes to colonizing, to entrenching apartheid laws and dispossessing the indigenous Palestinians.
So would it be true to say that Israel avoids some of the petty apartheid, or seemingly avoids the petty apartheid of South Africa, by subcontracting the residential zoning, Jewish-only areas over the vast bulk of the land Israel controls to the JNF? And in that sense, the JNF, while operating in Britain, an honorary patron being Tony Blair as a supposed charity, is actually a pillar of Israeli apartheid. Have I got that right?
Actually, Israel used to avoid appearance of applying petty apartheid as existed in South Africa until the Jewish nation-state law was passed a couple of years ago in 2018. After that, through this law, Israel and its Knesset and government and the entire justice system basically belongs to the Jewish nation and to it alone. Only the Jewish nation has a right to self-determination in the entire land of Israel, and that does not discriminate between the occupied Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, or the pre-67 State of Israel. It's all the State of Israel, and Israel should do much more, invest much more in setting the entire land with Jews. That's what this racist law says. So now it's no longer hidden. It's very much in your face apartheid. This came about with the Trump administration's rise to power. Israel felt that it no longer needs this mask, liberalism and democracy, while underneath it hides a very vicious, ugly system of apartheid and racism. Now it can be very open and say, yes, we are practicing apartheid, no problem whatsoever. Many Israeli politicians, many are saying that Israel is bluntly applying apartheid. International law experts like Professor Richard Falk have reached that conclusion that Israel is indeed applying apartheid to the entire Palestinian people in the occupied territories of 67, within the 48 territory or pre-67 territory of Israel, and against Palestinian refugees in exile.
So you've no time for those apologists for Israel who try to say that Israel's in danger of drifting into an apartheid state. From a Palestinian perspective, this has long been the case, yeah?
Yes, this is based on some weird notion that has no place in international law, that only when Palestinians become, again, a majority in our own indigenous ancestors' land, does Israel then qualify as an apartheid state? As if you have to have a minority racial group ruling over a majority and oppressing it to qualify as an apartheid state. But that's not the definition of apartheid in international law. The Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court clearly defines apartheid as racial domination, legalized, institutionalized racial domination by one racial group against another, denying it equal rights by law, regardless of who's a majority and who's a minority. There's no mention of minority-majority. So yes, many Israel apologists, many liberal, so-called liberal Zionists are trying to say, if Israel annexes large swaths of the West Bank, it risks becoming an apartheid state. Well, guess what? Since 1948, Israel was constituted as an apartheid state upon the expulsion of the majority of the indigenous Palestinians and the destruction of Palestinian lives and livelihoods.
Final question, if I may, Omar. I've found campaigning against the JNF for many years that to win the argument against the JNF is pretty easy. Once you talk about 94% of the land surface of Palestine discriminates against Palestinians and so on and so on. Do you think the nation-state law and other developments have made the JNF vulnerable to campaigning?
I think it has. I think now that the links between the JNF and the government of Israel, the State of Israel, are clearer than ever, now that the State of Israel has unabashedly, without any masks, adopted the apartheid principles that the JNF has always had in its charter, this relationship has become much more in the open, and it has become far less tenable for the JNF to claim that it's a charitable organization. It is clear now, anyone who does basic research for 15 minutes can see that the JNF is still supporting Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank, especially in and around occupied East Jerusalem. It is still funding projects by the Israeli army, despite that the United Nations said that the Israeli army crimes in Gaza might amount to war crimes or crimes against humanity. JNF is part of that. And the JNF is still deeply involved in Israel's ethnic cleansing of Bedouin Palestinian citizens of Israel, indigenous Palestinians in the Negev or Naqab desert. So the JNF is now involved in serious violations of international law and certainly should be stripped of its charitable status in every country.
Omar, thanks very much. We're going to be working closely with Palestinian partners to challenge the JNF in our own legal jurisdictions in many, many parts of the world. But thanks very much for sharing your thoughts with us today. Omar Barghouti.
Thank you very much, Nick. And I would like to not just the Scottish Solidarity Campaign and the PSC in the UK, but also our progressive Jewish partners, International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, and many progressive Jewish groups in the US and Canada that have campaigned for years against the JNF. We deeply, deeply appreciate all your work.
For sure. Thanks again, Omar.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Next slide. And again, okay. We've shown today that the JNF is a fundamental pillar of Israeli apartheid. It's massively involved in ongoing ethnic cleansing as well as the whole history. We think it's greatly overstretched. British Park, the Coretta Scott King Park, the South Africa Park, De Valera Park. These are all pressure points where we can campaign against the JNF around the world in these 4 and many, many other jurisdictions. So we invite you to register for the upcoming webinars, where we'll go in greater depth into many of these topics. But we want to build, as other people have already started building and built, a political legal campaign against the JNF wherever we can reach them, and that's in over 44 countries worldwide. This is Mick Napier thanking you. These are some of the speakers who will be coming up. This is Mick Napier thanking you on behalf of Stop the JNF and asking you to register for the next 5 webinars, and get in touch if you wish to join the numerous campaigns against the racist Jewish National Fund. Thank you. Goodbye.